Sometimes loneliness is so deep that it turns a simple man into someone capable of betting his heart on a letter. Jack Thornfield stood before the fogged mirror of the small wooden house he built with his own hands. The reflection showed a man that hard labor had carved over the years, calloused hands that knew every stone on his property, every furrow of the barren land he called home. By the time he was 42, he had turned 200 acres of dry land into something resembling a dream. But dreams, he discovered, are empty when there is no one to share them. The letter rested on the oak table that he had carved himself. The yellowed paper bore words written in delicate handwriting, promising a companion willing to build a new life in the West. Eleanor Walsh. The name sounded like music in his thoughts. She had responded to the ad he placed in the Boston newspaper 3 months ago, a desperate attempt to fill the silence that echoed through the house every night. The wind blew through the ill-fitting planks of the wall, bringing with it the smell of sage and dry earth. Jack folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. The train would arrive in 2 hours, and with it, a woman who had entrusted her entire life to a stranger based only on words exchanged over hundreds of miles. He walked to the balcony and watched the landscape that stretched out before his eyes. The distant mountains seemed to be silent guardians of their small property. Cattle grazed quietly near the stream that cut through the land, the only reliable source of water for miles. It was little, but it was honest. It was his. The wagon had been prepared for hours. The horses, 2 strong animals that knew every stone of the way to the city, waited patiently tied to the post. Jack checked the reins one last time, adjusted the worn hat that protected him from the inclement sun, and climbed into the driver's seat. The journey to the station would take an hour, enough time for all the doubts I had buried in recent months to come back to the surface like weeds after the rain. What did you know about Eleanor beyond what she chose to share in her letters? That she had lost her parents at a very young age, that she had worked as a housekeeper in family homes in Boston, that she dreamed of space and freedom. Who was looking for, like him, a chance to start over? The sun was in the middle of the sky when he spotted the black smoke from the locomotive on the horizon. Her heart beat faster, a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. The station was just a wooden platform and a small building that served as the telegraph office. But for Jack at that moment, it was the place where his life could change forever. He got off the wagon and tied the horses to the scant shade of a lonely tree. The train's whistle echoed across the plain, announcing its arrival. Jack wiped his hands on his pants and adjusted the clean shirt he had saved for special occasions. There were not many special occasions in his life, but this was certainly one of them. The train stopped with a metallic noise of brakes and steam. A few people came down, merchants and travelers, whom Jack recognized from occasional visits to the city. But his eyes searched for a woman alone, someone who looked around with the same mixture of hope and nervousness that he felt. It was then that he saw her. Eleanor Walsh stepped off the train carrying only a small, worn-out leather suitcase and a look that mixed determination with a vulnerability that touched something deep in Jack's chest. She was shorter than he had imagined, with brown hair tied up in a simple bun and a faded blue dress that had seen better days. But there was something in his green eyes that spoke of inner strength, of someone who had weathered storms and yet had chosen to bet on a new horizon. She looked around the small station with an expression that Jack couldn't quite decipher. It was not disappointment, but perhaps a quiet realization that he was really far from everything he knew. When their gazes met, she offered a shy but genuine smile. Jack walked over, taking off his hat with a respectful gesture. The proximity revealed small details that the letters could not convey. The way she held the suitcase tightly, as if it were all she had in the world, the small but calloused hands from work, the shoes that showed signs of many walks. During the journey back to the farm, they talked little. The clatter of the wheels of the cart on the stones of the path filled the silences, along with the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves. Eleanor watched the landscape unfolding before her, vast tracts of land that seemed to stretch to the end of the world. Jack noticed how she took in every detail, from the cacti that dotted the landscape to the mountains that towered over the horizon like sleeping sentinels. When they arrived at the property, Jack got out of the wagon and reached out to help her. The touch was brief, but he felt the slight tremor in his fingers, a mixture of fatigue from the trip and nervousness about what was to come. Eleanor looked at the wooden house, at the small garden he had tried to cultivate, at the corral where a few chickens scratched quietly. Jack carried her suitcase to the balcony and stopped in front of the door. For a moment, neither of them moved. The weight of the moment hung between them like the dust that the wind raised from the parched fields. It was then that Eleanor spoke for the first time since they had left the station. Her voice was soft, but there was a raw honesty in it that caught guard. She said she had lied in her letters, not about important things, he quickly explained, but about his situation. She was not just a housekeeper in search of a new life. She was a woman who had lost everything when the family she worked for went bankrupt, leaving her without references and without means of support. Jack watched her as she spoke, noticing how she kept her chin up even as she admitted her vulnerability. There was dignity in his honesty, a courage he recognized because he had seen it in the mirror in his own most difficult moments. He led her into the house, showing her the simple rooms he had so carefully prepared. The small but clean room, the kitchen with the wood stove that he had repaired especially for his arrival, the room that had been his and that he now offered to her without hesitation. Eleanor stood in the center of the room and looked around with an expression that Jack couldn't fully interpret. There was gratitude there, but also something that felt like apprehension. She held the suitcase against her body as if it were a shield. That's when she said she didn't bring anything to contribute to the wedding. No dowry, no savings saved, no family treasure, just the clothes she wore and the hope that this would be enough to start a new life with a man she knew only through words written on paper. Jack was silent for a long moment, absorbing what she had shared. Outside, the wind made the wood of the house groan softly, a familiar sound that always comforted him in moments of uncertainty. He looked at Eleanor, at the brave woman who had traveled across a continent based only on faith that she could build something good with a stranger. Then he said the words that would change both of their lives forever. Jack looked deeply into Eleanor's green eyes, seeing there not only vulnerability, but a strength he recognized in himself. The silence extended for a few seconds that seemed eternal, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks of the house. Then he spoke, with a simplicity that carried the weight of a solemn promise. "Everything I have is yours." The words came out without hesitation, as if they had been waiting inside him all his life. He saw how Eleanor blinked rapidly, surprised by the sheer sincerity in his voice. It wasn't just a courtesy phrase or an attempt to console her. It was a declaration, a commitment that was born of something deeper than sympathy. Eleanor slowly let out the breath she didn't even know she was holding. The suitcase slipped out of his hands and landed on the wooden floor with a soft sound. For a moment, she didn't seem to know what to say. I had expected many possible reactions: disappointment, regret, maybe even anger at not being completely honest from the start. But I did not expect this disarming generosity. Jack approached her slowly, respecting the space between them, but making it clear that his offer was genuine. He began to talk about ownership, not with the pride of an owner, but with the humility of someone who understood what it meant to start from scratch. He showed him how he had built each room in the house with wood he had cut himself, how he had dug the well in the backyard for 3 consecutive summers until he found clean water. He led her to the kitchen window and pointed to the small garden where some vegetables were bravely fighting the arid climate. He explained how he had learned what kind of soil worked best for each crop, how he had discovered that some plants thrived even with little water if they were cared for with patience and dedication. Eleanor listened to every word, realizing that Jack wasn't just showing off his ownership. He was sharing his story, his struggles, his small triumphs. Every detail he pointed out carried memories of lonely nights, of difficult decisions, of moments when he almost gave up, but decided to continue. When he took her to see the animals, Eleanor noticed how the chickens approached him without fear, how the horses neighed softly at the sight of him. There was a gentleness in his actions that contrasted with his calloused hands and rustic appearance. This was a man who knew how to take care of things, who understood that sometimes being strong meant being tender. During the days that followed, Jack demonstrated his promise through actions. When Eleanor mentioned that she knew how to sew, he brought fabrics that he had kept in the city, bought months before without knowing exactly what they would be used for. When she commented that she loved to cook but was worried about the limited ingredients, he revealed a small pantry that he had carefully stocked, with spices and preserves that he had traded with traveling merchants. Eleanor began to realize that Jack had prepared for her arrival in ways that went far beyond what she could have imagined. It was not just a house that he offered, but a home designed for two people. The kitchen table had 2 chairs, even though he had lived alone for years. The closet had space clearly reserved for women's clothing. Even the small mirror in the room had been positioned at the right height for a woman shorter than him. But it was during a particularly hot afternoon, when Eleanor was struggling to hang clothes on the line as the strong wind threatened to wash everything away, that she really understood what Jack had offered. He appeared next to her without a word, held the rope of the clothesline tightly so that she could work with tranquility. It wasn't just practical help, it was partnership, a quiet understanding that they were a team now. That night, sitting on the porch after dinner, Eleanor finally found the courage to ask him why he had placed the ad in the newspaper. Jack was silent for a long time, watching the stars that began to appear in the darkening sky. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a melancholy that she had not yet heard. He told about the years of solitary work, about how he had built it all dreaming of the day when he would have someone to share. Not only the successes, but also the difficult moments. He talked about the nights when the silence of the house seemed so oppressive that he would go out to walk around the property until he was tired enough to sleep. Eleanor listened without interruption, recognizing in his story echoes of her own loneliness. She had spent years taking care of other families' children, warming homes that would never be hers, building routines and affections that always ended when she was no longer needed. It was at that moment that she understood that Jack's offer was not charity, it was recognition. He saw in her someone who understood what it meant to build a life from nothing, someone who knew the value of the little things because he had learned to live without them. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was firm but emotional. He said he had never expected to meet someone who understood that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept kindness. That he had spent so much time being independent that he had forgotten how good it was to have someone who wanted to share the burdens of life. Jack turned to look at her in the dark of the balcony, seeing only the outline of her profile against the starry sky. He said kindness wasn't what he felt for her. It was something deeper, more complex. It was the feeling that he had finally found someone with whom he could be completely honest about his fears, his hopes, his failures. Eleanor smiled in the darkness, a smile that Jack couldn't see but could hear in the tone of her voice when she replied that she was beginning to understand that perhaps she had brought something valuable to this union after all. Not gold or property, but the ability to recognize a good man when he met him, and the courage to build something new with him. The night wind was blowing softly now, bringing the smell of sage and the promise of rain in the clouds that were forming on the horizon. For the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor felt truly at home. The weeks that followed brought a subtle but profound transformation to Jack's small estate. They were not dramatic changes that stood out, but rather delicate changes that spoke of two lives that slowly learned to intertwine. Eleanor had begun to leave her mark on the house without even realizing it. A new curtain in the kitchen window, made of fabric Jack had brought from town, small vases of wildflowers she picked during her morning walks, the aroma of fresh bread that now filled the house every morning. Jack watched these changes with a quiet gratitude that sometimes surprised him. He had lived so long alone that he had forgotten how nice it was to wake up to the sound of someone moving around the house, how comforting it was to come home from work in the fields and find signs that someone had been there, taking care of things he didn't have the time or knowledge to take care of alone. Eleanor, in turn, discovered aspects of Jack that the letters could never have revealed. The way he spoke softly to the horses when he thought no one was listening, how he cared for a calf he had rejected by his mother, patiently feeding it 3 times a day. There was a tenderness in his actions which contrasted with the harshness which the work in the West had etched into his face and hands. One morning, while Eleanor was preparing breakfast, she noticed Jack standing in the kitchen doorway, just watching her work. When he asked if something was wrong, he nodded slowly and said he was just getting used to the idea of not being alone anymore. The simple honesty of the answer touched something deep in her heart. It was on that same day that Eleanor made a decision that had been quietly maturing in her heart. After Jack left to tend the cattle, she walked to the small trunk where she kept her most precious belongings. Inside, wrapped in a piece of yellowish silk, was a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. It was the only thing of value he had, carefully guarded all the hard years, a tangible link to a life he had left behind. Eleanor held the ring against the light coming in through the window, watching how the metal caught and reflected the sun's rays. For years, she had imagined that one day she would sell it if the need was too desperate. But now, for the first time, she saw another purpose for him, not as something to be sacrificed, but as something to be offered. When Jack returned for lunch, he found Eleanor waiting for him on the porch with an expression he couldn't fully interpret. There was determination there, but also a vulnerability that made him stop and pay full attention to what she had to say. Eleanor reached out her closed hand towards him and slowly opened her fingers, revealing the golden ring that rested on her palm. He explained that it was all that was left of his family, the only thing of value he had brought on his journey across the continent. For a moment, Jack thought she was offering the ring as payment, as a way to contribute financially to their union, and he was ready to kindly decline. But then Eleanor explained that she wasn't offering the ring as payment. "I was offering him as a symbol. I wanted him to know that he had chosen to stay, not out of necessity or lack of options, but because he had found in him something he didn't know he was looking for. A man who understood that sometimes the most valuable things in life cannot be measured in gold or property." Jack looked at the ring, then Eleanor, then again at the small metal circle that carried so much meaning. He understood that she wasn't just offering a family heirloom. He was offering confidence. He was saying that he saw in him someone worthy of guarding not only his most precious possessions, but also his deepest feelings. With infinite care, Jack took the ring from her palm and held it up to the light, as Eleanor had done moments before. Then, completely surprising her, he knelt before her right there on the porch, the midday sun creating dancing shadows around them through the planks of the ceiling. Jack said he had thought a lot about marriage in recent weeks. Not the correspondence marriage they had arranged, based on mutual need and hope, but a true marriage based on choice, on knowledge, on something that had grown between them like the hardy plants of their garden, slowly but with deep roots. He placed the ring on her finger with a bow that made Eleanor's eyes fill with tears. They were not tears of sadness, but of relief, of gratitude, of a happiness she did not expect to find when she got off that train weeks ago with only a suitcase and an uncertain hope. That afternoon they walked into town together, holding hands, to talk to the pastor about holding a real wedding ceremony. Not because the law required it, but because they both wanted to mark the moment when two lonely people consciously decided to build a shared life. The ceremony was simple, held in the small wooden church with only the pastor and his wife as witnesses. Eleanor wore her best dress, the blue one she had worn on the trip, but now she saw it with different eyes. It was no longer the outfit of a desperate woman fleeing a difficult past, but the dress that a woman in love chose to wear on her wedding day. Jack had found a clean white shirt and a vest that had belonged to his father, carefully stored in a trunk for years. When they stood in front of the pastor, they both understood that they were doing more than exchanging vows. They were choosing to believe that two imperfect people could create something beautiful together. The months that followed brought challenges that tested this new union. A particularly dry summer threatened the crops, and Eleanor worked side by side with Jack to salvage what they could of the crops. When a storm damaged part of the roof, she held onto the ladder while he repaired the boards, and then helped pick up the debris scattered around the yard. There were moments of tension, as happens between any couple who learn to live together. Arguments about money when economies were down, debates about priorities when they had to decide between fixing the corral or buying seeds for the next planting. But these disagreements never touched the solid foundation they had built together. Eleanor discovered that she had a talent for negotiating with the town's merchants, getting better prices for the farm's produce than Jack had ever been able to do on his own. Jack discovered that Eleanor had an intuitive understanding of animals, knowing when a chicken was about to get sick or when a cow was struggling to calve. Together, they built the small property into something more prosperous than Jack had ever dreamed of achieving on his own. Not just financially, although that was also true, but in terms of purpose and significance. Every improvement they made, every decision they made, was the result of two minds working in harmony. One night, almost a year after Eleanor's arrival, they were sitting on the same balcony where they had shared their first confidences. The house now showed clear signs of being inhabited by two people: curtains on the windows, a more elaborate garden, a second rocking chair that Jack had built so they could sit together in the afternoons. Eleanor looked at Jack and said that she sometimes thought about that woman who had gotten off the train with only one suitcase, convinced that she had nothing to offer. He seemed like a completely different person now, someone she barely recognized. Jack smiled and replied that he sometimes thought about the lonely man who had placed an ad in the newspaper because he could no longer bear the silence of his own home. They had become different people together, not because they had fundamentally changed, but because they had discovered parts of themselves that could only exist in partnership with another person. Jack's generosity had blossomed when he had someone to direct it to. Eleanor's strength had found its true purpose when she had something real to protect and nurture. As the stars appeared in the immense sky above their heads, Eleanor took Jack's hand and said that she finally understood what he had offered that first day. It wasn't just a house or a property or financial security. It was a chance to discover who she really could be when she had someone who believed in her worth, even when she doubted it herself. Jack shook her hand and replied that she had given him something equally valuable in return. It had shown him that a man could be strong and tender at the same time, that caring for someone was not a burden, but a source of joy, that a house only became a home when it was shared with the right person. The night wind blew gently across the plain, carrying with it the promise of another day, another dawn that would meet two people who had learned that sometimes the best things in life begin when we are brave enough to share our vulnerability with someone who understands our worth. Eleanor had arrived with nothing tangible, but she had brought with her the ability to transform a lonely house into a purposeful home. And Jack, by offering everything he had discovered that he received back much more than he had given. Together, they had built something that neither of them could have created on their own, a life worth living. If this story touched your heart, you'll love getting to know other exciting Wild West narratives that we bring you every week. Each story is carefully crafted to thrill and inspire, showcasing the strength of human character in difficult times. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these adventures that celebrate courage, love, and hope in the wild heart of the American West.